There is a farmhouse in Hydesville, New York, and it is the night of the 31st of March, 1848, and something is knocking. Not the wind, not the settling of old timber, not a mouse in the wall. Something is knocking in a pattern, a deliberate pattern, a pattern that two young girls in their beds have been listening to for weeks, and that tonight, for the first time, their mother has decided to answer. She claps her hands. The knocking responds. She claps twice. Two knocks come back. She asks out loud into the dark of the farmhouse whether she's speaking with a human being. No knock. She asks whether she's speaking with the spirit. The knock comes. The knock comes again and again and again. And in that moment, in a rented farmhouse on a dirt road in upstate New York in the middle of the 19th century, a movement is born that will sweep across the United States and then across the ocean to Britain and Europe and beyond, that will attract the attention of presidents and prime ministers and the greatest scientists of the age, that will become the fastest growing religious movement in American history, that will shake the foundations of Victorian Christianity, that will produce the most elaborate and most sustained attempt in the history of the modern world to establish empirical contact with the dead, and that will end, for most of its participants, in heartbreak, exposure, and a silence from the other side that was always in the end more eloquent than any knock. This is the history of spiritualism, and it is stranger, more human, more devastating, and more consequential than the polite word séance suggests. The Fox sisters were not the beginning of humanity's attempt to communicate with the dead. They were merely the occasion for that attempt to become a mass movement in a specific historical moment. The desire to reach the dead is as old as recorded human history and probably considerably older. Every civilization that left enough of a trace for archaeologists to study shows evidence of practices aimed at maintaining contact between the living and the dead, practices that assume that death does not end the existence of the person who has died, but merely relocates them to a different plane of being from which communication, under the right conditions, remains possible. The ancient Egyptians built their entire civilization around this assumption. The Book of the Dead is a manual for navigating the afterlife, but it is also a guide for the living on how to maintain relationship with those who had made the journey. The Mesopotamian civilizations practiced necromancy, the ritual summoning of the dead for counsel, and the most famous scene of this kind in Western literature is the moment in the first book of Samuel when the witch of Endor summons the dead prophet Samuel for King Saul on the eve of the battle in which Saul will die, a scene in which Samuel, irritated at being disturbed, tells Saul exactly what he does not want to hear. The Greeks had the Nekaya, the ritual descent to the underworld, or the ritual summoning of the dead to the surface, memorably depicted in the 11th book of Homer's Odyssey, when Odysseus digs a trench at the edge of the world, fills it with animal blood, and waits for the shades of the dead to come and drink and thereby regain enough coherence to speak. The Roman tradition had its Lemuria, a festival in May when the head of the household rose at midnight to walk through the house, making specific gestures and spitting black beans and repeating a formula that was supposed to expel the restless dead from the domestic space, an apotropaic reversal of the summoning rituals, but grounded in the same assumption that the dead were present, active, and potentially dangerous. In China, ancestor veneration has been a continuous practice across thousands of years, with regular offerings to the dead and the assumption that the ancestors can and do influence the affairs of the living. In Japan, the Obon festival, which is still observed, is explicitly a time when the spirits of the dead return to visit their families. In West Africa and in the African diaspora, traditions that survived the Middle Passage into the Americas, the relationship between the living and the dead is not a matter of occasional ritual but of continuous daily life, woven into every dimension of religious and domestic practice. None of this constitutes spiritualism in the specific sense. Spiritualism, with a capital letter, refers to a specific movement that originated in the United States in 1848 and that distinguished itself from prior traditions of communicating with the dead in several important ways. It claimed to be empirical rather than religious. Fendi, it presented spirit communication not as a matter of faith or tradition or cultural practice, but as a demonstrable fact that could be investigated using the methods of science. It insisted that the evidence for survival after death could be collected, evaluated, and verified in the same way that evidence for any other natural phenomenon could be collected, evaluated, and verified. And it happened in a specific historical moment in a culture that had recently been destabilized by the collision of Christian faith with the early rumblings of scientific challenge, and in which enormous numbers of people were looking for a framework that could tell them that the people they had loved and lost were not simply gone. The Fox family had moved to the farmhouse in Hydesville, a hamlet in Wayne County in upstate New York, was in December of 1847. The family consisted of John Fox, his wife Margaret, and their two younger daughters, Margaretta, who was 14, and Catherine, who was 11. Two older daughters were already married and living elsewhere. The farmhouse had a reputation. Previous tenants had reported unexplained sounds and disturbances. The Fox family heard the sounds too, the knockings and rappings that seemed to come from inside the walls, and attributed them initially to the settling of the old house in the cold winter nights. But the sounds did not behave like settling timbers. They came and went at irregular times. They seemed to respond. And on the night of March 31st, Catherine, the younger girl, challenged the invisible presence directly. She snapped her fingers and said, "Do as I do, Mr. Splitfoot." The knocks responded, matching the number of her snaps. Her mother took over, establishing the first crude communication with what the family quickly concluded was a spirit. Questioning established that the spirit was the ghost of a peddler who'd been murdered in the house and buried in the cellar. Neighbours were invited to witness the rappings. Word spread. The story broke in the local press. By the summer of 1848, the Fox sisters and their mysterious knocking spirit were the most talked about curiosity in upstate New York. The context in which this happened is crucial to understanding why it became what it became. The burned-over district, as the historian Whitney Cross called upstate New York in a book of that name. This was so called because it had been swept repeatedly by waves of religious revival and millennial expectation throughout the first half of the 19th century. This was the region that produced the Second Great Awakening, the most intense Protestant revival in American history. It was the region from which Joseph Smith issued his revelations that produced the Mormon Church. It was home to the Shakers, whose ecstatic worship practices had made them famous throughout America and Europe. It was the incubator of numerous utopian communities experimenting with alternative social arrangements, and it was saturated, in 1848, with the influence of Swedenborgianism, the theological tradition derived from the visions of the 18th century Swedish mystic Emanuel Swedenborg, who claimed to have visited heaven and hell and spoken with angels and the dead on a regular basis for the last 27 years of his life, and who had described those visits in meticulous detail across 15 volumes of theological writing that were as specific and concrete as a surveyor's report. Emanuel Swedenborg is one of the most fascinating and most underappreciated figures in the history of Western religion. He was born in Stockholm in 1688, the son of a Lutheran bishop, and spent the first half of his life as one of the most accomplished scientists and engineers in Europe, producing significant work in metallurgy, physiology, astronomy, and mathematics. At 56, he had a series of visions and dreams that marked what he understood as the opening of his spiritual sight, and after which he claimed to move freely between the physical world and the spiritual world, to converse regularly with angels and with the spirits of the dead, and to understand the inner meaning of the biblical scriptures in a way that had been closed to all previous interpreters. He did not found a church during his lifetime and regarded himself as a loyal member of the Lutheran Church of Sweden. His followers founded the New Church, or the New Jerusalem Church, after his death in 1772, and it spread throughout England and America throughout the early 19th century. His ideas about the spiritual world, particularly his insistence that it was continuous with the physical world, that the dead continue to exist as real persons in a real environment, and that the quality of one's inner life determined one's experience after death, provided the immediate theological framework within which the Fox rappings were interpreted by the educated Americans who first heard of them. The Fox sisters were taken to Rochester by their older sister Leah, who was already a formidable personality, and who quickly understood that her younger sisters possessed a remarkable and commercially valuable gift. In Rochester, the rappings were demonstrated before audiences that included prominent citizens, clergymen and journalists, and the response was intense enough to establish the pattern that would characterize spiritualism for the next half-century. Enthusiastic belief from those who witness phenomena they could not explain, determined skepticism from those who suspected fraud, and a middle ground of uncertainty occupied by serious investigators who wanted better evidence before committing to either conclusion. The Rochester rappings, as they were called, made national news within months, and by 1850 the phenomenon of spirit communication had spread from upstate New York to cities along the eastern seaboard and was beginning to appear in the Midwest. The mechanism of spirit communication evolved rapidly in the early years of the movement. The rapping code in which spirits indicated letters of the alphabet by knocking an appropriate number of times was clumsy and slow, but it worked well enough to produce messages of some specificity. And those messages were often specific enough about the private circumstances of the sitters to produce effects of overwhelming emotional power in people who had recently lost a loved one. The medium, the person through whom the spirits communicated, emerged as the central figure of spiritualist practice. Mediums were predominantly women, which was itself a significant social fact in mid-19th century America and Britain. The medium's role, as understood within the spiritualist framework, required a surrender of the ordinary self, a passivity and receptivity that allowed the spirit to use the medium's body and voice as instruments. This was a form of public power available to women at a time when almost no form of public power was. And several of the movement's most celebrated mediums explicitly understood their mediumship as a form of social authority that bypassed the normal channels of male institutional gatekeeping. The trance medium operated in a state of apparent unconsciousness, speaking in voices different from her own, moving in ways she could not remember afterward, sometimes writing in handwriting that bore no resemblance to her waking hand, sometimes speaking languages she did not know, or demonstrating knowledge of subjects she had never studied. The physical medium produced phenomena of a more dramatic kind, objects moving without visible contact, musical instruments playing without hands, lights appearing in darkened rooms, materialized hands and faces, and eventually full-form materializations of the spirits themselves, appearing in the dim conditions of the seance room, and sometimes photographed by investigators who hoped that the camera, that most trustworthy of witnesses, would provide the definitive evidence that individual testimony never quite could. The seance itself, the ritual gathering in a darkened room around a table, medium at the center, sitters holding hands in a circle, became one of the defining cultural rituals of the Victorian era, practiced in parlours and drawing rooms and hired halls across the English-speaking world and eventually across Europe. The speed with which spiritualism spread from those first rappings to a genuine mass movement is astonishing. By 1853, there were estimated to be more than 3 million practicing spiritualists in the United States alone. The number had grown to 11 million by the early 1870s, according to some contemporary estimates, though these figures need to be treated with caution, since there was no formal membership structure and self-identification, as a spiritualist could mean anything from attending occasional seances to organizing one's entire life around the conviction that the spirit world was continuously accessible. In Britain, the movement arrived in the early 1850s and spread through the same combination of press coverage, public demonstrations, and personal testimony that had powered its American growth. By the 1860s, spiritualism was present in France, Germany, Italy, Russia, Brazil, and Australia. It was, within 20 years of the Hydesville rappings, a genuinely global phenomenon. The social breadth of the movement's appeal was remarkable. Spiritualism was not confined to the uneducated or the credulous. Its American advocates included Abraham Lincoln, who held seances in the White House during the Civil War years, partly at the insistence of his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, who was desperately seeking contact with their son Willie, who had died in 1862. Horace Greeley, the most influential journalist of mid-19th century America, investigated the Fox sisters personally and gave the movement crucial press support. The British movement attracted similarly elevated patronage. William Gladstone, 4 times Prime Minister, expressed serious interest. Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, became one of the most prominent spiritualist advocates of the early 20th century, after the loss of his son in the First World War converted him from interested skepticism to passionate belief. Sir Oliver Lodge, a physicist of genuine distinction who had done important work on electromagnetic theory, spent the later years of his career attempting to provide scientific evidence for survival after death, motivated in large part by the death of his son Raymond in the same war, and published a book called Raymond in 1915 that described his communications with his dead son through mediums and became one of the best-selling books of the war years. The appeal to the bereaved is impossible to overstate as a factor in spiritualism's growth and persistence. The 19th century was saturated with death in ways that the developed world has largely managed to insulate itself from. Infant mortality rates that we would now consider catastrophic were a normal feature of family life. Epidemic disease swept through communities with a regularity that made the loss of children, siblings, parents, and spouses a virtually universal experience. The Civil War in America killed 600,000 men, leaving behind a country of widows and bereaved parents on a scale that had no precedent in American history. The First World War did the same for Britain and Europe, producing a tidal wave of grief so immense that it overwhelmed the ordinary mechanisms of mourning and created a desperate receptivity to any evidence that the dead were not simply gone. The seance room offered something that no church and no scientific institution could offer in those years: a direct, personal, specific encounter with a lost individual who knew things only that individual could have known, and who said things that felt like the real voice of the real person, reaching across whatever gap separated the living from the dead. It also, of course, offered something that unscrupulous people could exploit with considerable profit. The history of spiritualism is inseparable from the history of spiritualist fraud, because the conditions of the seance, the darkened room, the emotionally vulnerable sitters, the expectation of the extraordinary, and the impossibility of fully controlling the environment were ideal conditions for deception. Mediums cheated, many of them, probably most of them at least some of the time. They used accomplices who gathered personal information about sitters before seances and fed it to the medium through signals. They used trick furniture and hidden compartments. They used luminous paint on telescoping rods to produce ghostly hands in darkened rooms. They wore elaborate disguises to impersonate materialized spirits, counting on the sitter's own emotional investment to fill in whatever details the impersonation failed to supply. The annals of spiritualism are full of exposures, mediums caught in the act, cabinets found to contain hidden spaces, accomplices confessing, apparatus discovered. The Fox sisters themselves, Margareta and Catherine, then gave a famous public confession in 1888, in which they demonstrated on stage how the rapping sounds had been produced by the cracking of their toe joints, a confession they partly retracted and partly maintained in the months before their deaths, leaving the question of what actually happened in Hydesville as uncertain as it has always been. And yet the history of spiritualism is not simply the history of fraud and the people who were deceived by it, because alongside the fraud, and sometimes in the same medium and the same seance, there were phenomena that the fraud hypothesis does not cleanly account for, phenomena that were witnessed by observers whose credibility was high and whose motives for belief were insufficient to explain away the care and rigour with which they recorded what they had seen. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in London in 1882, was the most important institutional response to the challenge that spiritualism posed to conventional science. Its founders included some of the most distinguished minds in late Victorian intellectual life. Henry Sidgwick, its first president, was the professor of moral philosophy at Cambridge, and one of the most careful and most honest thinkers of his generation. Frederick Myers, who became the SPR's most important theorist, was a Cambridge classic scholar who had abandoned Orthodox Christianity and who devoted the second half of his life to the investigation of the empirical evidence for survival after death with the same rigour he would have brought to any other scholarly problem. Edmund Gurney was another Cambridge scholar, he a man of exceptional intelligence and extraordinary personal charm, who worked on the SPR's early investigations until his death in 1888, in circumstances that may have been suicide and that were themselves never fully explained. William James, the American philosopher and psychologist who was one of the founders of pragmatism and one of the most important American intellectuals of his generation, was closely associated with the SPR's American branch and brought to it the same combination of genuine open-mindedness and genuine rigour that characterized everything he did. The SPR's investigators did not approach their subject as believers looking for confirmation. They approached it as scientists looking for reliable evidence, and they found, in the course of their investigations, that reliable evidence was considerably harder to obtain than the movement's advocates claimed, but that the residue of phenomena that survived careful investigation was not nothing. The census of hallucinations that the SPR conducted in the 1880s, which gathered and analysed accounts of visual and auditory hallucinations from over 17,000 respondents, found a statistically significant excess of cases in which the hallucination occurred at or near the moment of the death of the person hallucinated, a finding that suggested something worth investigating, even if it did not constitute proof of anything. The investigation of telepathy, the apparent transmission of information from one mind to another without sensory mediation, produced evidence in controlled experimental conditions that the investigators found compelling and that was sufficiently robust to generate serious debate in the scientific community. The medium who most impressed the SPR's investigators and who generated the most controversial evidence in the entire history of psychical research was a Boston housewife named Leonora Piper. Piper entered a trance state during seances and produced, through the various personalities who spoke through her trance voice, a stream of verifiable information about the private circumstances of sitters that her investigators found extraordinarily difficult to explain through ordinary means. Richard Hodgson, the same investigator who had written the devastating report on Blavatsky and the Theosophical Society, and subjected Piper to the most extended and careful investigation of any medium in history, observing her séances over a period of 18 years, arranging for detectives to follow her between séances to check whether she was gathering information by ordinary means, introducing anonymous sitters whose identity she could not have known, and testing the consistency of what the communicating personalities said across many sessions. His conclusion, published in 1895 after 8 years of investigation, was that the evidence for genuine supernormal information in Piper's séances was overwhelming, and that he could not account for it through any hypothesis of fraud or normal information gathering. This was not a credulous man making a credulous judgment. This was the same man who had exposed Blavatsky, more a man whose professional identity was built on skeptical investigation, concluding that he had found something he could not explain away. Frederick Myers died in 1901, having spent 20 years investigating the evidence for survival after death, and having written an enormous 2-volume work called Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death, published posthumously, which remains one of the most comprehensive and most serious treatments of the empirical evidence for the paranormal ever produced. Myers had designed, before his death, a series of tests for the possibility of post-mortem communication, arrangements with fellow researchers in which specific information would be transmitted through mediums after death that could only be verified by the living researchers who held the other half of the arrangement. And these tests, known as the cross-correspondences, produced over the following decades a body of mediumistic material so complex, so interlocking across multiple mediums in different countries who had no contact with each other, and so specifically responsive to the classical scholarship and personal circumstances of the dead researchers whose communications they purported to be, that the investigators who spent years analysing them found it extremely difficult to account for them without positing some form of genuine post-mortem intelligence directing the process. The cross-correspondences were not rapping. They were not a materialised hand or a spirit photograph. They were an attempt by whatever was producing them to meet scientific investigation on its own terms, to produce evidence of a kind that would be as difficult as possible to explain away through normal means, evidence whose full significance could only be grasped by people with extensive knowledge of classical literature and the personal histories of the dead researchers involved. Whether they succeeded in that goal is a question that researchers are still debating. The cross-correspondences were published in the Proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research over a period of decades, running to many thousands of pages, and the literature that has grown up around them is itself a substantial body of work. The honest answer is that they have never been satisfactorily explained by either the survivalist hypothesis or by any normal hypothesis, and that they remain one of the most genuinely puzzling bodies of evidence in the entire literature of psychical research. Physical mediumship was a different matter. The history of physical mediumship is the history of the most dramatic claims and the most devastating exposures in the entire spiritualist literature, and it is not possible to give an honest account of it without acknowledging both the genuine strangeness of some of what was reported and the industrial-scale fraud that characterized much of what passed under the same name. Daniel Douglas Home was the most celebrated physical medium of the 19th century, and one of the very few who was never publicly caught in fraud, though his detractors were never satisfied that the investigations to which he submitted were adequate to rule it out. Andy Home was a Scottish-American medium who worked for more than 20 years in the drawing rooms of European aristocracy and in the presence of scientists and intellectuals of the highest standing, producing phenomena that included the levitation of his own body, the handling of red-hot coals without injury, the elongation of his physical body, the playing of musical instruments without contact, and the appearance of materialized hands that were felt and sometimes grasped by sitters in well-lit conditions. William Crookes, the physicist who discovered the element thallium and who was later knighted and who served as president of the Royal Society, is investigated home in 1870 and 71 in controlled experimental conditions and published a report stating that he had observed genuine supernormal phenomena that he could not explain by any known physical law. Crookes also investigated Florence Cook, a young London medium who produced full-form materializations of a spirit known as Katie King, a 17th century pirate's daughter, who would emerge from the cabinet in which Cook sat in trance, walk among the sitters, allow herself to be touched and examined, and carry on extended conversations before returning to the cabinet, after which Cook would be found still bound in her chair. Crookes conducted his investigation over several years and concluded that Katie King was a genuine materialization distinct from Florence Cook, a conclusion that subsequent investigators have largely attributed to his personal infatuation with the medium, rather than to sound experimental method. Cook was caught in fraud on several occasions later in her career, and the Katie King phenomena are now generally regarded as fraudulent, though the mechanism of how they were produced in the conditions Crookes described has never been entirely satisfactorily explained. The career of Usapia Paladino, the Italian medium who was the most extensively investigated physical medium of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, illustrates with particular clarity the maddening complexity of evaluating physical mediumship. Paladino was an illiterate peasant woman from southern Italy who produced physical phenomena of a striking kind: table levitations, materializations, on the depression of surfaces by invisible hands, the apparent transportation of objects. She was investigated by committees of scientists in Italy, France, England, and the United States, and the verdict was consistently ambiguous. She cheated when she could get away with it, which her investigators acknowledged freely. When she was held under conditions that prevented cheating, the phenomena sometimes still occurred. Charles Richet, a French physiologist and Nobel laureate, investigated her over many years and concluded that her phenomena were genuine under strict controls. A committee of Cambridge academics, including Sidgwick, Myers, and Richard Hodgson, investigated her on the island of Roubaix in 1894 and reached a similar conclusion. A subsequent American investigation in 1909 concluded that all her phenomena could be explained by fraud. The question of what Paladino actually was, genuine medium who sometimes cheated, fraud who sometimes produced genuine anomalous phenomena, or something else entirely, has never been resolved. The relationship between spiritualism and the wider culture of the 19th century was not confined to the private drama of the seance room. Spiritualism had a politics. The movement in America from its earliest years was associated with radical social reform, with abolitionism, with women's rights, with free love, and with the critique of institutional religion and institutional marriage that was the common property of the American radical tradition in the 1850s and 60s. This was not accidental. The same cultural impulse that led people to challenge the authority of the churches over questions of the afterlife tended to lead them to challenge the authority of other institutions over other questions, and the spiritualist movement attracted freethinkers, reformers, and radicals in disproportionate numbers from its earliest years. Victoria Woodhull, the first woman to run for President of the United States in 1872, was a prominent spiritualist medium who claimed to receive political guidance from the spirit world. The suffragist movement in both America and Britain had significant overlap with spiritualism, partly because mediumship provided women with a form of public authority that bypassed male gatekeeping, and partly because the spiritualist critique of institutional religion extended naturally to a critique of the institutional religion-backed social arrangements that kept women subordinate. In Britain, spiritualism was one of the currents feeding the labour movement and the early socialist politics of the late 19th century. The idea that all human beings were immortal souls on an evolutionary journey, that the apparent differences of class and race and sex were temporary conditions rather than permanent natural arrangements, and that the universe was governed by moral laws that would eventually balance all inequalities, was an equalitarian metaphysics that translated readily into equalitarian politics. Robert Owen, the Welsh social reformer who was one of the founders of the cooperative movement and one of the most influential socialist thinkers of the early 19th century, became a convinced spiritualist in his 80s and spent his final years arguing that the evidence of spirit communication confirmed the social vision he had spent his life pursuing. William Stainton Moses, an Anglican clergyman who became one of the most respected British mediums of the 1870s and 80s, used his automatic writing, which produced an extensive body of teaching attributed to a group of elevated spirits calling themselves the Imperator Band, to develop a form of progressive spiritual philosophy that influenced British spiritualism for decades. The First World War was the event that transformed spiritualism from a Victorian curiosity into something closer to a mass religion, particularly in Britain. The scale of loss was unprecedented in modern British experience. Nearly 1 million British soldiers were killed in 4 years, leaving behind almost 1 million bereaved families whose grief had no adequate cultural container. The Church of England, which should have been the institution providing that container, had largely committed itself to supporting the war and had little to offer the bereaved beyond the same patriotic language that had sent the dead to their deaths. Into that gap came spiritualism, and specifically came Arthur Conan Doyle, whose celebrity made him the most effective advocate the movement had ever had, and whose personal loss. So his son Kingsley died of pneumonia following wounds in 1918, gave his advocacy the emotional authority that only genuine grief can confer. Conan Doyle had been interested in spiritualism since the 1880s, but had maintained a cautious and investigative position, attending séances, reading the literature, and withholding final judgment. The war changed him. He became a convert, a true believer, and he threw himself into the advocacy of spiritualism with the same energy and organization he had brought to every other campaign in his public life. He wrote a 2-volume history of spiritualism published in 1926. He lectured across Britain, the United States, Australia, South Africa, and several European countries. He established spiritualist organizations, funded spiritualist publications, and used his fame to secure access to platforms and audiences that the movement could not otherwise have reached. He corresponded with heads of state. He debated skeptics in public. He spent an estimated £250,000 of his own money in the service of the cause. His advocacy also made him the victim of one of the most curious episodes in the history of spiritualism. In 1917, 2 young girls in Cottingley, near Bradford, produced photographs purporting to show fairies at the bottom of their garden. The photographs came to Conan Doyle's attention in 1920, and he published them in the Strand magazine as evidence not exactly of spiritualism, but of the broader thesis he had been developing, that the invisible world was real, that it contained beings of many kinds, and that ordinary perceptual barriers between the visible and the invisible were thinner than materialism assumed. The Cottingley fairy photographs were eventually revealed in 1983 by the women who'd produced them as girls, Frances Griffiths and Elsie Wright, as fabrications using paper cutouts. Their revelation was greeted with widespread satisfaction by those who had always suspected Conan Doyle's judgment was distorted by the intensity of his belief. Frances Griffiths, however, maintained until her death that while the photographs were faked, she genuinely had seen fairies, a claim that complicates the simple fraud narrative in ways that the comfortable debunking account tends to ignore. The tension between belief and evidence that runs through the entire history of spiritualism was nowhere more dramatically illustrated than in the long contest between Harry Houdini and Arthur Conan Doyle. The two men were close friends for several years in the early 1920s, a relationship that produced an extraordinary correspondence and that ended in complete rupture over the question of mediumistic fraud. Houdini was the greatest escape artist in the history of performance, a man who'd spent his career demonstrating that apparently impossible physical feats were achievable through technique and preparation rather than supernatural power. He had a personal stake in the question of mediumship, having promised his mother before her death that if any medium could convey an authentic message from her, he would believe. He investigated dozens of mediums and found fraud in every case, including the celebrated Boston medium Marjorie Crandon, whose claims had impressed several SPR investigators, and who was considered by her advocates to be the most evidential physical medium of the early 20th century. Houdini duplicated every one of Crandon's phenomena through ordinary conjuring techniques and demonstrated the duplications publicly. He was so determined to expose fraudulent mediumship that he maintained a private arrangement with his wife Bess, that after his death he would attempt to communicate through a medium using a pre-arranged code that only they knew. When he died on Halloween of 1926, the Houdini Séances began. Bess held annual séances for 10 years. No medium ever produced the code, but even Houdini, whose commitment to the fraud hypothesis was as complete as Conan Doyle's commitment to the authenticity hypothesis, acknowledged that there was something about Leonora Piper's mental mediumship that he could not explain to his own satisfaction. He exposed physical mediums. He never exposed Piper. The distinction between physical mediumship, which was demonstrably and pervasively fraudulent, and mental mediumship, which operated through the production of information rather than the production of phenomena, and was correspondingly more difficult to explain away, was one that serious investigators were drawing throughout the 1920s and 30s. Physical phenomena could be faked with sufficient skill. The consistent production of accurate, specific, and verifiable information about complete strangers by a person in trance was harder to account for, though the expanding knowledge of cold reading techniques, the methods by which skilled performers could extract and feed back information from sitters while appearing to receive it from elsewhere, offered an explanation that skeptics found adequate even when believers did not. The 1920s and 30s were both the peak and the beginning of the decline of organized spiritualism as a mass movement. The bereaved millions of the First World War had given the movement numbers and urgency that it had never possessed before. The establishment of the Spiritualist National Union in Britain in 1902 had given the British movement an institutional framework. The National Spiritualist Association of Churches in America, just founded in 1893, provided a similar structure for the American movement. By the 1920s, there were hundreds of spiritualist churches meeting weekly, conducting services that combined hymns, prayer, and clairvoyant demonstrations in which the medium offered messages from the dead to members of the congregation. These services continue today, in Britain particularly, where the Spiritualist National Union still maintains a network of hundreds of churches and where spiritualist practice has achieved a kind of institutional respectability that it never quite managed in America. But the intellectual credibility that the movement had been building since the SPR's founding began to erode in the same decade. The exposures accumulated. The Marjorie Crandon case, which had been built up as the definitive proof of physical mediumship, and which collapsed under Houdini's and other investigators' scrutiny, was a particular blow. The cross-correspondence material, which had been the most sophisticated and most difficult to explain evidence in the survivalist literature, lost its primary investigators to death, and the movement never found scholars of equivalent quality to carry the analysis forward. The great mediums of the classic period died, and their successors rarely matched either their reported phenomena or the calibre of investigation they attracted. Gladys Osborne Leonard was the most impressive British mental medium of the interwar period, and her long career under investigation by the SPR produced a body of evidence that some researchers still regard as among the best available for survival. She worked with Radcliffe Hall, the author of The Well of Loneliness, whose partner Mabel Batten had died in 1916, and the transcripts of their sittings with Leonard form one of the most emotionally raw documents in the entire spiritualist literature, a record of a woman using every available resource to maintain contact with the person she had loved most. Whether Leonard was receiving genuine communications from the dead or producing accurate information through some process involving extreme sensitivity to the emotional cues of her sitters, or doing something that was both simultaneously in a way that makes the distinction less clear than it appears, is still an open question in the literature. The relationship between spiritualism and the developing science of psychology was complex and often hostile, but it was not without its productive dimensions. William James's engagement with the SPR led him to think more seriously about the varieties of religious experience and the nature of consciousness than he might otherwise have done. His Varieties of Religious Experience, published in 1902, is in part a response to the questions that psychical research had raised about the boundaries of ordinary consciousness and the reality of the experiences that those boundaries sometimes seem to contain. Frederick Myers's concept of the subliminal self developed in his human personality to account for the extraordinary range of capacities that appeared in hypnosis, trance, and mediumship, was a significant contribution to the early psychology of the unconscious, and influenced both James and, through the work of Theodore Flournoy, the early development of analytical psychology. Carl Jung acknowledged the influence of Flournoy's investigation of the medium Helene Smith on his own, thinking about the unconscious and its contents, and his doctoral thesis, submitted in 1902, was an analysis of the phenomena of a young medium who may have been his cousin. The link between spiritualism and what became the channeling tradition of the late 20th century runs through a series of figures and movements that maintain the essential claim that intelligent beings from beyond the ordinary physical world could communicate with and through selected human receivers, while progressively detaching that claim from both the spiritualist framework of communication with specific dead individuals and the scientific framework of evidence and verification that the SPR had insisted on. Jane Roberts, the American writer who channeled the entity known as Seth, beginning in 1963, and whose Seth books became enormous bestsellers in the New Age market of the 1970s and 80s, described a process recognizably related to spiritualist mediumship, but framed in terms of multidimensional reality and the nature of consciousness rather than in terms of the survival of specific dead persons. Helen Schuchman, who channeled A Course in Miracles beginning in 1965, described her process as taking dictation from an inner voice that identified itself as Jesus Christ, in a register that was explicitly and consistently divorced from the evidential framework that spiritualism had built around its claims. The movement founded by the Brazilian medium Francisco Candido Javier, known as Chico Javier, represents one of the largest and most socially significant developments of the spiritualist tradition outside the English-speaking world. Xavier was a Brazilian spiritist, working in the tradition of the French educator and spiritualist Allan Kardec, who had systematized Spiritism as a philosophical and religious framework in the 1850s, and whose books had become the foundational texts of the Brazilian Spiritist movement that is today one of the largest religious traditions in South America. Xavier produced over 400 books through automatic writing, attributed to spirits ranging from the recently dead to historical figures to elevated spiritual entities, and his work generated a social and philanthropic movement in Brazil that has established hospitals, schools, and social services on a scale that has made Spiritism one of the most practically consequential religious traditions in that country. Xavier was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize twice. His death in 2002 was the occasion of national mourning. Whatever one concludes about the source of his writings, the social consequences of the tradition he embodied are not trivial. The question that spiritualism raised and never definitively answered, whether consciousness survives the death of the body, and whether that survival can be empirically demonstrated, remains as open in the 21st century as it was in the 19th. The evidence base is different. The methods of investigation are more sophisticated. The understanding of the psychological mechanisms that can generate apparently paranormal experiences has advanced enormously. Cold reading has been documented in extensive detail. The social psychology of the séance room, the ways in which expectation and emotional need, and the dynamics of the group environment shape perception and memory, is much better understood than it was when the SPR's first investigators sat down at their séance tables. The case for the fraud and psychology explanation of spiritualism's phenomena is substantially stronger now than it was in 1882, and yet the residue that serious investigators acknowledge remains. The best cases of mental mediumship, Leonora Piper and her successors, have not been explained to the satisfaction of everyone who has examined them carefully. The cross-correspondences remain in their several thousand pages of published proceedings, available for anyone to examine, and the alternative explanations that have been proposed for them are not obviously more convincing than the survivalist hypothesis. The experimental evidence for telepathy that the SPR gathered in the 1880s has been replicated in controlled laboratory conditions many times since, and the statistical evidence for some form of anomalous information transfer between minds is, at this point, fairly robust, even if its mechanism is entirely unclear. The question of whether that mechanism involves survival is not answered by demonstrating that telepathy exists, but it is also not answered by demonstrating that telepathy does not require survival to occur. The Fox sisters are buried in a cemetery in Rochester. Margaretta's confession is on record, so is her partial retraction. The house in Hydesville was eventually moved from its original location, became a museum, and burned down in 1955. The site is now a small park with a historical marker. If there is anything still there, it has not made itself known by rapping, but the question the rappings raised is still there. It is always going to be. It will be there as long as people die, which is to say as long as people love, which is to say as long as there are people at all. Of the person who has watched someone they love disappear into the absolute silence of death, and has stood at that edge and wondered whether the silence is real or merely apparent, whether what was most essentially that person has ended or only changed its conditions of existence, whether the love that connected the living to the dead continues in some form on a shore that no living person can see. That person is not asking a foolish question. They are asking the oldest question, and every rapping in every darkened room and every trance voice speaking in a dead person's cadences and every automatic script in a dead person's hand was an attempt, however imperfect, however often fraudulent, however always insufficient to answer it. The spiritualists were wrong about many things. They were sometimes fraudulent. They were often self-deceived. They were always, at their best, brave. They took seriously the most serious question available to a human being, and they took it seriously in public, at a time when the two dominant institutions that claimed to answer it, the churches and the science, were both failing in different ways. That is not nothing. That is in fact the beginning of every honest inquiry into the hardest things. The table is still. The candle is out. The hands are unclasped. We are waiting, as we have always been waiting, for something on the other side to answer. There is a dimension of the spiritualist story that the standard historical account, moving as it does from exposure to exposure and fraud to fraud, tends to bypass entirely. That dimension is what the séance room actually felt like from the inside, not for the investigators with their notebooks and their controls, but for the ordinary people who went there in genuine grief and who sometimes received something that changed their lives. The historical record is full of their testimonies that are almost impossible to evaluate with any confidence, but that are equally impossible to dismiss with honest indifference. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the poet, attended séances with Daniel Douglas home in Florence in 1855 and found herself deeply moved by what she experienced, writing to her sister that she had witnessed things she could not explain and felt things she could not deny. Her husband Robert Browning attended the same séances and left in contempt, convinced of fraud, and wrote a poem called Mr. Sludge the Medium that is one of the most savage portraits of a fraudulent spiritualist ever committed to verse. The difference between them was not a difference of intelligence or of observation. It was a difference of emotional orientation to the question, and it illuminates something real about how the séance room worked and why it produced such radically different responses from people sitting in the same room witnessing the same events. The American journalist and reformer Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose novel Uncle Tom's Cabin had done as much as any single document to shift Northern public opinion against slavery, became a convinced spiritualist after attending séances in the 1860s and described the experience of apparent contact with her dead son Henry as the most consoling and most real experience of her life. Henry had drowned in a swimming accident in 1857 at the age of 19, a death that devastated his mother and from which she never fully recovered in the conventional sense. Whether the contact she experienced in the séance room was real in the sense she believed it to be is not a question this account can answer. What is clear is that it was real in the sense that it mattered, that it changed how she lived with her grief, and that the framework it gave her for understanding death and continuation shaped her thinking and writing for the rest of her life. And the relationship between spiritualism and the emerging field of clinical psychology is more interesting and more productive than is usually acknowledged. Pierre Janet, the French psychologist whose work on dissociation was one of the foundations of modern understanding of trauma and hysteria, conducted extensive investigations of mediums and trance states in the 1880s and 90s, and developed from those investigations a model of the unconscious and its relationship to the ordinary waking personality that influenced Freud and even more directly influenced Jung. The medium in trance, Janet observed, behaved in ways that were structurally similar to the behavior of hysterical patients whose secondary personalities emerged under hypnosis. And his analysis of the mechanisms of both phenomena contributed substantially to the conceptual framework that made modern psychology possible. Spiritualism gave psychology its first systematic laboratory for the study of altered states of consciousness, and the debt has never been adequately acknowledged. Flournoy's investigation of Helen Smith in Geneva in the 1890s is perhaps the clearest example of this productive relationship. Helen Smith, whose real name was Catherine Elise Muller, was a Geneva shop girl who produced in trance states a variety of remarkable phenomena, including communications in what appeared to be Martian language, past life memories as Marie Antoinette and an Indian princess, and contacts with elevated spiritual beings. Theodore Flournoy, a professor of psychology at the University of Geneva, investigated her carefully and sympathetically over 5 years, and published his findings in 1899 in a book called From India to the Planet Mars, that is one of the most carefully observed and most readable documents in the entire literature of psychical research. His conclusion was that Smith's phenomena were products of what he called cryptomnesia and subliminal imagination, unconscious elaboration of forgotten material combined with genuinely impressive, creative, and psychological capacities, rather than genuine contact with the dead or with Martians. His analysis was not reductive in the dismissive sense. He took Smith seriously as a human being, and her productions seriously as evidence of something remarkable about the depths of human unconscious functioning. His book is a masterpiece of sympathetic skepticism, and it remains one of the most important texts in the literature of both psychology and psychical research. The tradition of spiritualist healing, which ran alongside the more publicly visible tradition of spirit communication from the movement's earliest years, represents a dimension of spiritualism that has also been largely written out of the standard accounts. Healing mediums, who claim to channel healing energy from the spirit world through their bodies and hands, were a significant presence in spiritualist practice throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and some of them attracted large followings and produced testimony of healing effects that resisted easy dismissal. Harry Edwards, who worked as a healing medium in Britain through the middle decades of the 20th century, he claimed to have participated in thousands of healings and attracted an enormous following. The National Federation of Spiritual Healers, founded in Britain in 1954, grew to thousands of members and is still active. Whether the healing effects attributed to spiritual healing are genuine, and if so, what mechanism produces them, whether it involves any form of spiritual agency or is better understood as a potent form of the placebo effect, operating through the relationship between healer and patient, is a question that has been seriously investigated without definitive resolution. The contribution of women to the spiritualist movement as mediums, organizers, lecturers, and theological innovators is one of the most important and most under-examined aspects of its history. The medium's role offered women in the 19th century a form of public authority and public speech that was available through no other legitimate channel. A woman in trance, speaking with the voice of a spirit, was in the curious position of exercising extraordinary influence over her audience, while simultaneously disclaiming personal responsibility for what she said, since the voice and the ideas were attributed to the spirit rather than to her. This duality allowed mediums to say things that no woman in her own voice could have said in respectable Victorian society, to challenge religious orthodoxy, to advocate for social reform, to speak about sexuality and death and the nature of God in terms that would have been scandalous from a woman's own mouth. Cora L.V. Tappan, who began lecturing as a trance medium in the 1850s at the age of 15, spoke to audiences of thousands about abolitionism, women's rights, and progressive theology, in words she attributed to her spirit guides, and was celebrated as one of the most eloquent speakers of her generation. The trance protected her and permitted her simultaneously. The spiritualist tradition's relationship to African American religious life is one of the least explored dimensions of the movement's American history. The intersection of spiritualism with the African American experience was complex and sometimes fraught, operating at the intersection of the movement's formal universalist commitments and the racial realities of 19th and 20th century America. But within African American communities, particularly in New Orleans and other southern cities, a tradition of spiritualist practice developed that was distinct from the white middle-class spiritualism of the Northeast, and that drew on a mix of West African religious traditions, Haitian Vodou, Catholic saints' cults, and Anglo-American spiritualism to create something genuinely hybrid and genuinely distinctive. The spiritual churches of New Orleans, which continue in various forms to the present day, represent one of the most theologically creative expressions of the spiritualist impulse in American religious history. The investigation of spiritualism by scientists did not end with the SPR's classic period. Rhine's Parapsychology laboratory at Duke University, established in 1935, attempted to subject claims of extrasensory perception, including the kind of information transfer that occurred in mental mediumship, to statistical experimental methods that would meet the standards of conventional psychology. Rhine's experiments with Xena cards, the symbols on which became briefly famous through popular culture, produced statistical results that Rhine and his colleagues regarded as robust evidence for some form of anomalous information transfer, and that his critics attributed to methodological errors and possibly fraud on the part of some of his subjects. The controversy over Rhine's methodology ran for decades and was never fully resolved, but it established parapsychology as a recognized, if marginal, academic field, and produced a tradition of experimental investigation that continues in several universities today. The Ganzfeld experiments, which became the primary paradigm for experimental parapsychology from the 1970s onward, attempted to create conditions for telepathy by placing the receiver in a state of mild sensory deprivation and measuring whether their verbal reports of mental imagery showed a statistical correlation with images being focused on by a sender in another room. The results of Ganzfeld experiments, when subjected to formal meta-analysis by the statistician Jessica Utz in 1995, produced an effect size that she concluded was significantly above chance, and that she argued constituted genuine evidence for anomalous information transfer. The response from mainstream science was skepticism tempered by acknowledgement that the statistical case was less easy to dismiss than earlier parapsychological claims had been. The question remained, and remains open. The philosophical implications of survival after death, if it is real, are not trivial. If the person who was Shakespeare or Beethoven or Einstein continue to exist in some form after physical death, the implications for our understanding of consciousness, creativity, personal identity, and the nature of the universe are enormous. The spiritualist movement took these implications seriously and tried to develop a theology adequate to them, a theology in which death was a transition rather than a termination, in which the development of consciousness was the central purpose of existence, and in which the relationships formed in physical life had a permanence and significance that physical death did not end. This theology was never systematically developed in the way that the great theological traditions of Christianity and Buddhism and Islam were developed, partly because the movement lacked the institutional structures and the scholarly resources for systematic theology, and partly because its empirical commitment made it suspicious of doctrine. But the theological vision was there, in the teachings of Myers and in the automatic writings of Stainton Moses, and in the Seth books and in 100 other places, and it represented a genuine attempt to think through what it would mean for how we lived. If the core spiritualist claim turned out to be true, it would mean, among other things, that nothing was wasted, that the love given to people who died before it could be fully received was not lost, but held in a form that transcended the physical circumstances of its origin, that the person who died in confusion and suffering was not defined by that confusion and suffering, but would have the opportunity in whatever came next to grow beyond it, that the moral seriousness with which one conducted a human life was not merely a matter of social convention or evolutionary pressure, but was connected to the actual structure of a universe in which the quality of one's inner life had consequences that extended beyond the boundary of physical death. These are not trivial ideas. They are the ideas that most human beings, confronted with the actual experience of loss and grief and the approach of their own death, find themselves wanting to be true. And the spiritualist movement's great achievement, and perhaps its great limitation, was to insist that the question of whether they were true was one that could be and should be answered by evidence rather than by faith. The evidence has not decisively answered it. The table still sits in the centre of the darkened room. The hands are around it, the circle is closed, and the medium is waiting in whatever state the medium waits in before the voice arrives, or does not arrive, before the message forms or does not form, before the silence continues or is broken by something that sounds, for a moment, like the voice of someone who should not still be speaking, and yet, impossibly, persists. The Fox sisters were two girls in a farmhouse in upstate New York who heard a knocking in the dark and decided to answer it. Everything that followed from that decision, the seances and the exposures and the SPR and the wars and the grief and the investigations and the channeling and the churches and the experiments and the arguments that never end, was the consequence of that original impulse. The impulse to answer, the refusal to accept that the silence of death is the only thing on the other side of whatever it is that death is. That impulse is not going away. It is as old as love. It will be here as long as love is. The movement it produced may rise and fall and change its name and change its methods and continue to be caught in fraud and continue to produce things that fraud cannot explain. But the impulse underneath it, the human refusal to believe that the people we loved most have simply stopped, is not a pathology, and it is not a delusion. It is the form that love takes when it runs out of living people to hold on to and reaches, with whatever it has, toward wherever they went. Whether anything reaches back is the question. It has always been the question, and it remains, as it has always been, the most important unanswered question in the world.